And now moving on to the Hall of Fame. So I'm going to briefly summarize this because we at least have a few people here that haven't been to a meeting since we established this in 2021. But Mike Kelly, again, sitting over there somewhere. Mike Kelly in 2021 said, we need to do a better job of recognizing the people that really do the heavy lifting and do the work of the association. And out of that idea came both the Outstanding Service Award as kind of an annual thing, and then more like the Lifetime Achievement thing, which we decided to call the Hall of Fame. And we've inducted, sort of the primary AABC founders. We've inducted 3 modern nominees to this point, which is Galen, George Ebert, who oversaw the TB exam for so many years, and Joe Baumgartner, who has overseen Tab Journal for, I can't even count how many years it has been now, but 30 some odd years has been doing that. And then here and there, we've been adding additional people from long ago. Many of them no longer with us, but there's still a lot of important people in AABC that have not been given this honor yet. And so we want you to understand that we haven't stopped on this yet, right? There's still more people that are out there that deserve this honor. This year for the 60th, we decided to go a little bit big on this. Because it's the anniversary year, we're going to talk about AABC's history and legacy and all these things. So we are doing some more inductions this year. And the first that we're going to talk about today is a pair of brothers. This is Ray Wiesman and Bill Wiesman from Wiesman Inc. In the Baltimore, Maryland area. And it's interesting because the Wiesman family has been a really integral and important part of AABC's history. Literally since its founding in 1965, because that was the year that these two gentlemen formed their company. They jumped on that idea at the same time, and so they were involved from day one. They were in all those discussions. From talking to, I of course never got to meet these gentlemen, but from old conversations with Ken, from conversations with with the members of the family that are still with us. They were often described as opposites, and I'm betting that a lot of you in this room, especially those of you that work with like a two-partner situation, I bet a lot of that times that's the case as well, right? You're not partnering with somebody that's exactly like you. You're partnering with somebody that has the opposite skills and strengths and weaknesses that you do. But these two are apparently often described that way. But it created a legacy that is still echoing in AABC 60 years later. So Ray, considered the quieter half of that partnership, really excelled at doing the administrative aspects of TAB, the estimating, the sales, and he was also one of the first that really keyed in on training as something that was going to be a difference maker, something that was going to distinguish AABC firms from other companies out there that were just kind of going through the motions. So he was really one of the first ones to push that idea. Ray served as a fairly early president from 1974 to 1976. And during that time, while he was president, he pushed to begin the development of AABC's first training program. And he was also one of the first people to speak up and say, maybe we need to think about not trying to run this entire thing by ourselves as volunteers. Maybe we need to hire a management firm to make, so that we can focus on, our true core skills. Ray is one of those folks, and Chris, I think it was you that pointed it out to me, but Ray was a high school graduate, but he worked so long, so hard, and learned so much in the HVAC industry that he ultimately earned a PE license without having a college degree in engineering, and that's a rare thing. You really have to absorb a lot to get to that milestone that way. So a lot of respect for that. And then his brother Bill, the more outgoing one. If you see old pictures of AABC meetings, if you see a Wiesman more obviously having a really good time. There's a pretty decent chance I think that's Bill. That was just his personality. I was told his motto was a pretty simple: work hard and play hard. Bill put himself through college on night school, earned both a business and a mechanical engineering degree, and eventually became a PE himself. And he also followed in Ray's footsteps as president about a decade later. He was president from 1987 to 1988, focused on training, as did his brother before him. He was involved in the new corporate branding to end up with the logo that we still have today. And the other thing that the thread that I heard about Bill in particular was that he was a really gifted teacher. And all of us that do something well, there's that level of knowing something, and then there's that next level of knowing something so well that you are really good at teaching that skill to other people. And Bill was one of those people who just got tremendous respect because of the way he was able to train up and instill in people what he knew. And of course, hugely important for any balancing firm to be able to take people that are often raw when you guys get them. They've got some brains and they've got some hands-on wherewithal, but there's a lot more very specific knowledge that you have to impart to them. And Bill was one of those ones that just really excelled at that. And he also was one that he really encouraged family members to kind of branch out and form their own companies, including some that really essentially became his competitors. But he was fine with that. He believed in spreading that knowledge, out further. And really, if you look at there's Weisman DNA in maybe a lot more companies than you might realize, unless you happen to be on that part of the country. There's so many companies that had their start with somebody who was originally working for Weisman Inc. So those seeds that those two brothers planted, 60 years ago, they're still bearing fruit today, for them, for their companies, for AABC, and for the tab industry. And so for all that and for everything that they did for AABC, we'd like to induct Ray and Bill Weisman into the AABC Hall of Fame. And Joe and Chris, if you could come up and accept on their behalf. Thank you, guys. So for our next inductee, we're going to talk about Joe Flood. Flood and Sterling out of Pennsylvania. So going back to the mid 70s, and this is when Joe was president. There was the hot topic at that time was the organization had just recently, at the end of Ray Weisman's tenure, decided that they needed to move to a professional association management firm. And a lot of debates about that. So now we need to stay with Arnold Pearl. He's the one that got us here. And other people said, well, maybe he got it here, but maybe we need somebody else to take us to the next step. Tough decision. Probably wasn't any one right answer to it, but the main thing that AABC needed at that time was they needed somebody in the big chair, somebody leading things that was strong and could make a decision that they were confident was in the best interest of the association. And Joe about 10 years into his tenure as an AABC member, and as a member of the board, and then again having a seat as president, he was the right man for that right time. He had a reputation for integrity, technical acumen, strategic acumen. He was that leader that they needed at that time. And I'm also told, and I think Dan could probably elaborate on this better, but I was told one of Joe's tools in his toolbox was he was a very giving man in terms of how he would talk to people, and just very plain spoken and all that. But Joe had another level that was his voice. Joe had a booming voice, and Dan told me the story that Joe could, at any given point, he could basically just take over a meeting just by speaking up and just saying, all right, and just that voice alone would command respect. And then of course everything he had to say after that would ratify all of that. So it was tremendously important. During his 3 years as president, among other things, he was advocating for, and then also helped in the early development of the first TBE exam. And he was also one of the earliest people, even back in the 70s, to recognize that commissioning was going to be something that was going to become a bigger thing, that it was something that should go hand in hand in some form with test and balance. And he was really an advocate of saying, like, these two things, we need to stay close to this. We need to not let this entirely get away from us. We need to look at this as an opportunity and something we can capitalize on. And I was also told that Joe was a very avid golfer and a very avid tennis player, but that he played golf and he played tennis exactly the same way he approached the work he did with testing and balancing, which was that you were not going to break a rule of golf on Joe's watch. It's just that was not going to happen, because it says right there in that rule book that you may not move that ball, and that was his personality. He believed in doing things properly, and he stuck to that. But the last thing that quality that I was given to understand about Joe, he was unbelievably willing to help his employees, pay for them to go take classes, learn about things that they didn't yet know about, things that would help them, whether it was 6 months later or 3 years later or something. He was a huge proponent of expanding their minds, give them a chance to grow, trusting them that they would take advantage of those opportunities. And by the way he conducted all of those things, that at the end of the day, Joe just had, he just got a tremendous amount of respect just because of the way he conducted himself. He handled himself perfectly and with integrity. He led with integrity. He gave people respect, and therefore he got respect. So he was a huge part of AABC's early days, and for that reason, we would like to induct Mr. Joe Flood into the AABC Hall of Fame. And if I could ask his protege, Dan Ackery, who ultimately took over Flood and Sterling from him, to come up and accept on his behalf.
Thank you all. I thank Ray and the board for inviting me here to accept this award for Joe Flood. I started working for Joe Flood in 1973, and as Ray mentioned, he was big on education. And I think we all have to think about these pioneers of our industry. They pushed independence and integrity in everything we do. Truth is all that matters. You take your report, it's got to be repeatable, and Joe Flood was an advocate for all that. Everything we did had to be repeatable, it had to have integrity, it had to be truth, so we were never questioned about the authenticity of your report. So I just want to thank everybody here, and just remember those things in the way you run your business. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And then for our final induction for today, we're going to move to Larry Johnson. I never got to meet Larry Johnson, and I came so close to being able to meet Larry Johnson, but because I had started working for AABC, but hadn't been to a meeting he was there yet, and he passed. And everything that I ever heard about Larry, a lot from Ken, a lot from Jay, a lot from Todd, a lot from Jim McGee, everything I ever heard about Larry was, just made me bummed that I'd never got to meet the guy. Just seemed like a prince. So yeah, just a absolute Kentucky gentleman, heart of gold. That kind of thing came up over and over again when you listen to people talk about Larry. But absolutely, a great nose for business. He was a really beloved figure in AABC's history, and still is a beloved figure in AABC's history. And the story, or maybe the truncated version of the story of how he ended up in AABC, is that he was working for an HVAC equipment company, and he started asking himself, I wonder what happens when the equipment doesn't work right. And as he looked into that and decided that was interesting to him, and I'm sure just as importantly that there was a business and there was some money to be made, because he certainly knew that it didn't always work properly. So within 6 months of that, he had formed Thermal Balance in 1967, when AABC was still just 2 years old. And he joined AABC right after that. And Larry was always an active member. I mean, he's littered across the photos and everything that you see for the entire era that he was there. He was always there. But he was on the committee that produced the 4th edition of the ABC National Standards. He also had a hand in the TBE exam rewrite that was undertaken in the mid-1980s. And then, of course, he eventually served as president of AABC from 1985 to 1987. And at that point, he was overseeing a transition to a new management firm, which, always has its hiccups and, difficult decisions and angst and things like that. But he managed that whole process from the top. And just once again, on a personal level, I mean, his technical bona fides and all that he put into the organization are really just unquestionable. But just the note that he was gregarious, you just ever-present smile. I don't think I've seen a photo of him yet where he's not smiling. But he was generous. He was generous in word, he was generous in deed, he was generous in spirit. I loved the story of him driving turkeys around every holiday to bring them to his customers and other people, just loading up the trunk of his car. He didn't send somebody else to do it. He loaded them up in his own trunk, and he just drove around and took those to people that wanted them and needed them and that he wanted to have them. And just a great man that I wish I'd had the opportunity to meet. Larry was taken, way too young, as I said, in 2002. But I've always thought that he was definitely looking down just later that year with pride, because it was that year that his family and his company's legacy with AABC continued because that was the year that his son Jay was elected to the AABC board, and then obviously eventually became president himself. So for all that Larry did, for all that Larry was, and what he was to so many people in the organization, we'd like to induct him into the AABC Hall of Fame. And Jay, if you can come on up and induct your dad.
Thank you. This is an honor. And if Dad was here, he would be very humbled, but he would tell you that it's the organization, it's the board, it's the members that make it great. So, thank you.
I'm asking Jay to stay up here for just a second. Dan, I'm sorry to ask you to do this, but I just had a thought. And I think it's a good thought. Would you mind coming back up with Jay? The thing that occurred to me in this, as we're going through this, and of course the Weismans, were brothers, but in particular, that pairing of Joe Flood and Dan and Larry Johnson and his son Jay, it's like the two most common archetypes for how AABC companies endure. Sometimes it happens the way it did with Joe and Dan, and there either isn't a family member that's ready or willing to kind of step up and do that. So what do you do? And again, I know lots of you have been through this or are going through this or will someday. You need to find that person that, has the right values, has the right technical skills, has the right management skills, the right temperament, all of these things that you need to look for. And that's the guy. That's my protege. That's the one that's going to carry on my company's legacy. So that it happened that way with Dan and Joe Flood. And then in the Johnsons' case, as again happens with any number of AABC companies, this is why it's so easy to talk about you guys as a family, because in many cases it is a family affair. But when you've got, a son or a daughter, even in some cases, that is involved in the business, knows the business, has learned the business from you at your feet, and is like, yeah, I want to do this. This is something I want to do. And that's the other way that these companies endure. So many of these companies have been around for 50 years, 60 years, or at least 30 or 40. But that's how this kind of thing happens. And the other thing you can see from the fruits of that is Joe Flood, incredibly important person in AABC's early history, finds a protege, that person in DC on top of everything else, that becomes a board member, serves 14 years on the board of directors, puts in his time, in part because he's learned those lessons and he's learned that value, from the person who mentored him. And with the family, same thing. He's so steeped in it that you're thinking, I'm doing this. Certainly, we hope you're doing it because you like it and you want to do it, but there's definitely an element there of carrying on the legacy, in this case for a family. So you end up with two people so connected to two very important early people who then become, very important people themselves. And that's how the organization keeps growing. That's how it keeps getting better. That's why, the meetings get better. That's why everybody enjoys seeing each other so much. So it's the way that it gets improved. It's the way we keep building, and you all just need to keep finding, the people that are going to be that next generation of leaders, and maybe the next generation of people that we should honor. And something I want to add just about each of these guys, Jay served, as most board members do, 14 years on the board. Jay was a kind of a no-nonsense guy on the board. He looked for things to be done the right way. And as happens every now and then with presidents, Jay got dealt, a handful of, minor to medium-sized crises. And when that happens, the guy in the big chair needs to be the one that kind of steps up and says, there's no solution that's going to make everybody happy here, but I've decided this is the one that is the best for the organization, and that's the way we're going to go. And, Jay did that over and over again. And he's just, a wonderfully generous guy. Assume that came from your dad, maybe from your mom as well. And he's just a great guy to be around. And Dan picked up directly on Joe Flood's early focus on commissioning, and that stuck with him. And, Dan did not only 14 years of service on the AABC board, but Dan was the chairman of the original AABC Commissioning Guideline Committee, which also then became the committee that developed the first commissioning exam. Dan was the first president of ACG. He's the first and still only person that held both of those chairs, that held both of those titles. So, and I guess all I'm saying is, I'm sorry, I wanted to add one more thing about Dan because it made me laugh when he got to the microphone. Because that's a thing that Dan always did in board meetings. Dan does not have a booming voice, that just grabs hold of an entire room like that. But one thing that Dan always did in board meetings he would listen to his fellow board members intently for whole meetings, difficult discussions. We're not sure what we're going to do here. And he would listen and listen and listen and listen. And then you'd get to the end of the discussion. And then Dan would say, well, let's summarize this a little bit. Mm-hmm. And Dan would just tick off all the most important points that were being made by the different people and basically say, so based on all that, this is how I think we should go. And that's a hard thing to do. It's a really hard thing to do. But Dan didn't plan to say what he just said about Joe Flood when he stood up here and about what it meant for you, but it just came out of him. And that was always a characteristic of yours that I admired because it's not an easy thing to do off the cuff. So my point in all that is these are two very deserving, new, modern inductees of the AABC Hall of Fame. And please stand and give them a round of applause.